I'm just going to jump right into some questions that we prepared for our panelists here. You guys feel free to choose which ones you want to answer. So I got the first one here. What do you guys think are some of the top use cases to get started with network automation? Ken, you're up.
Yeah, so this was sort of covered a little bit, but I think the way to think of it is more of look into your context and look for easy wins, things that are low risk, and that you get big value out of. So, you want to be focusing on things that are unlikely to cause negative side effects, right? So, gathering information is easier than config. You're also going to sort of want to high-level factor in what gives you a big return on your effort in terms of time that you save. So, geared towards your context, I would start looking for those categories of things.
Yeah, pretty much the same thing. The only thing with it, maybe a bit more tangible, when I'm seeing a lot of either kind of what Nick showed in just config generation, not even configuration deployment. And then the other piece is just pre and post validation, getting ready, systematically change by change and understanding. I'm always doing kind of the same things, verifying OSPF and JCCs or CDP neighbors, whatever the case is. Yeah, pretty much the same.
Yeah, I actually don't have anything to add. Don't underestimate the value of read-only operations. There's a lot of value in that, especially for things you can present, as I think Jeremy showed with the Slack stuff, to users beyond the network users, sort of that self-service.
Yeah, and then the only other thing I'll add is, it's another form of read-only operation. And it was one of the guys at NTC, I don't remember, but he's like the biggest troll ever. And he managed to convince me, somebody challenged me over the internet to do something, and I listened. And he challenged me to write a comprehensive OSPF troubleshooter, which I did. And this is another example. It's collecting information. You can almost think of it as like a validation on the box. But it's not really pre or post because there's no operation happening, but it's just something you can run and say, hey, this is what my state should look like. I should have this many neighbors. I should see this many LSAs. This is whatever it should look like. And it can run and it can check that. So, you may be collecting information, but sometimes you just want to see that green check mark and say, hey, everything is the way I think it should be. And you can do that through troubleshooting scripts and things like that as well. So it all really fits into the same narrative that, just like in my case, if you can't, read-only operations or even no operations, like generated configurations, there's great value there.
Cool. I'll sum that up with low-hanging fruit and read-only. What about focusing on the enterprise, like an enterprise who's just starting their journey? Any type of advice you would disseminate to an enterprise before they start on the network automation journey?
The only thing I would say is just really start small and just understand, what your impact is, and set yourself up for success in terms of where you think you're going to be in a year. I think it's easy to kind of write your first Ansible playbook. You feel like, okay, I'm going to automate everything really quick, and kind of set the expectation incorrectly, and additionally set expectations incorrectly for what the rest of your team can do in terms of skills and energy and everything else. So just kind of really set expectations for the things.
Yeah, that's, me personally, that's a mistake I made. I think it was about 2 years ago now, I think is when I joined the FTC Slack, and I was like the newbie of noobs, I was like, yeah, I got to change a template. I was like, yeah, I got it. And then, next thing I'm trying to do the whole thing. And it wasn't hard because it's really just more of the same. But then you end up in an environment where you start to, the next level of questions start to get revealed, like, okay, I know how to do it. How many nerd knobs should I template out? How many different variables need to be mandatory versus optional, and how do I handle that? Then you end up with these just ridiculous amount of YAML files, and you just drown in it. And most of it has no value because you're either not going to use those operations or those knobs in your environment, or it's just not even worth programming in the first place. So, kind of like Ken said, just because you can do it doesn't mean you should. Find the specific things that make sense for your environment and do those. The only other thing I would say is, what you don't want to do is go and spend 3 months only on Ansible, get really good at it, and not know anything about CI/CD, Git, or the other components in the ecosystem that allow the whole thing to work well together. Otherwise, you'll just, frankly, you'll be like a script kiddie. You can't go back in time, you can't look at differences, you can't work with GitHub. So you're going to want to take kind of a balanced approach across that spectrum of kind of entry-level tools and build your base kind of parallel across those different things.
Yeah, so similar to that, I think it's helpful, and Matt sort of mentioned this earlier today, but you need to look to simplify your problem. So standardization really helps you. You want things to be the same. You want to simplify your problem. This is sort of part of an ongoing long-term process. If you make your hard problem too hard, you will not be able to solve it. If you make it be like, a differential equation, you might have problems working it out. I think it's also important to get organizational buy-in. Like, this is a long-term process, and I think you're going to be in the long term, fighting against the tide if your organization is not on board with trying to do this in a broader sense.
Yeah, I would add that I think particularly enterprises and enterprise IT have they tend to want to line all the ducks up before they get started. Do I have organizational buy-in? Who in the organization is going to do it? It's going to be the network engineering team, I'm going to have a software development team. And my recommendation is just do it. Just start and do something. Even if it's a proof of concept and it's in a lab, figure out something that's going to be compelling and go build something that doesn't. And you're going to figure out a lot from building it the first time, and you're going to get it wrong the first time, you're probably going to get it wrong the second time, and maybe the third time. But figure out that something's compelling and then go build something, and that will help get the buy-in, because if you can show something cool, even if it's mocked up in the lab and not something you can deploy in production, and people see it. It was like, I think you said, you showed it to them and they go, wow, I see the power of that, and now I'm going to buy into it. And worry less about where in the organization it's going to fit and how many headcount you're going to need. Just go start doing it.
Yeah,
The
no,
other
I
thing
gotta
I'd
add
add there too, these processes can be your own things that only you touch, which makes it a lot easier to actually do. And then you start to look like this magician because you're getting these things done because you have this sort of baked in set of stuff that you don't have to do any work on to have it accomplished.
Yeah, I just want to add that getting, you want to get that dedicated team together, getting fractions of people's time. It's really hard, right? Because everyone's always switching, content switching, putting out fires, and then come back to automation. So getting that dedicated time there really helps. So the next question is, do all network engineers need to know how to code?
I mean, I'll take a pretty controversial stance and say yes, because I think the word code is it's a word, it's a multifaceted word, like an onion. Like what counts as coding? I think it was Jeremy yesterday. I'm probably gonna get this wrong, but I'm gonna try to paraphrase what he said. Is there's a difference between I don't know. Somebody said it last night. I don't remember. We were all trying, but it was basically something to the extent of there's a big difference between software engineering and developing software with that in mind. Something like developing Ansible or developing NetMiko. You have a very different mindset from that than when you're writing a kind of goal-oriented script or something to do a task. And there's a very different mindset there. And I think that becoming software engineers is a profession, and it's difficult. It requires a different frame of thinking, and that's great. And some people go down that road, like Kirk is an example. But I think in general, all network engineers should at least have basic network programmability skills, not necessarily tool-specific skills, but there's, Hank had his toolbox thing up on the screen. There are so many options to pick from. Pick a few, learn how they work, and have at least some competence to be able to understand how the pieces fit, even if you're not an expert coder, and even if you're not able to build things that people consume. I think a lot of people get, I wrote this cool thing on GitHub, it's got 30 stars. I'm like, yeah, but cool. It's like, who cares? It doesn't matter if no one uses it, if it's useful for you, and you learn something doing it, and I think those are basic skills that we should all have as network people.
Yeah, I think there's a certain amount that needs to be done, even in the programming aspect, that requires sort of deep networking expertise. And I think it's particularly true around building your data models. You need to encode those data models in something. It's probably not going to be YAML files. It may be a SQL database or a graph database. You don't have to be a top-notch programmer to define those models, say in Python classes. But someone who's a straight-up coder and just writes Python is never going to figure out how to build those data models. And I would say that's probably my experience, the part where you most need network engineers that know some programmability. Because you can go hire people that can build a web UI, they can build a database, but if you want to figure out how you model your network, how you're going to use those models, you better have someone that knows something pretty deep about network engineering.
So maybe a little bit different than Nick. I'll say it could just be taxonomy or how we define what a programmer is. But I think having Linux and Git skills are going to be near requirements. But as far as programming, not necessarily. I think many people will just get to the point where if they can just get configuration management done, it may be enough for them. Their use cases may not require much more beyond that. I think most people just from configuration drift and all the common problems, but be able to update a YAML file. I'm not sure if I would call that person a programmer, but I think it's the skill sets that they need to understand. And I also think, maybe also, let's say on the high end of the networking side, like the network architects actually design and be in labs all the time, building this stuff, constantly the next generation designs. That might be just a small percentage. I'm not trying to, if it's 99%, it's 100%. But I also think that we often we kind of talk about this a lot. Network engineer would have to know something about the Git, Linux, that type of YAML. And network automation engineers should know how to build playbooks and kind of maybe in the Ansible world build some custom filters. But then the developer should understand programming and not as much. So you're going to have that blend in between there. And that network engineer may not have to go be an independent organization.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit biased because I teach both Python and Ansible. So, I definitely think no, in the sense of there's going to be plenty of roles where you do not need programming, and you could work on those for the rest of your career. Like, I'm sure you could be a mainframe programmer today if you wanted to. So there's a lot of skills where you're just not going to need this. It's not going to be essential to you. You can have a very fulfilling career. Now, that all being said, I think, for a lot of individuals, whether this is a majority or not, you can quibble. It's like, for a lot of network engineers, adding programming as a skill somewhere under their tool belt is going to be a very valuable thing to have. And I sort of view it as we have a range of spectrums. So, I sort of view it as like we have this range, and I sort of view it as, are you somewhere on that? You have some capability of programming, and there's sort of this arbitrary line of like, what the heck is a programmer? And it's arbitrary. Some people that I would say suck, they categorize themselves as programmers, and some people that I think are incredibly amazing, and I think it's irrelevant, but I think if you go 5 years into the future, 10 years into the future, I have a hard time seeing in the networking world, at least how I view it, that network automation is not going to become increasingly important, and that skill set for individuals is going to be important in general.
Yeah, I would comment to say just one data point from a friend of mine who works elsewhere in an organization that was very mature on their automation journey. And his point was, before we started on the automation journey, there were like 25 network engineers in that team. There's now 75 people in those teams. 15 of those are network engineer only, and the other 60 are some mix of head down coder and network engineer with strong scripting skills. So, and I would say if you really want to be valuable to an organization, a really good network engineer that's also a really good programmer is very rare and very sought after, and you'll have no problem finding a job.
Yeah, I will steal line from Jason, be the automator, not the automated. I still definitely believe that's resonates.
Okay, so aside from configuration management tools like Cisco NSO, Ansible, Salt, what are other tools that make sense to invest in from both like a learning and a financial perspective?
I'll say, I think we definitely hit up on a lot of this is, on the CI/CD front, like understand Jenkins and Travis or something to that effect. Skills-wise, I think just like we said, Git, but those things are going to become valuable, underlining pretty much anything we do.
Yeah, and I think some of the, we talked about them a little bit through the past few days is, things like Ansible and Salt, things like that, they're kind of a complete framework that you can put your tasks in, that come with inventory management, that come with a lot of pre-made code already, they're easy to consume. There is a kind of a variety or another hierarchy of different abstraction layers in terms of even like Python libraries. So for example, some of you may have used things like Paramico, and then maybe you have NetMico, a little more abstract, a little easier to use for networking, and then past that, maybe something like Napalm, which is even more abstract and allows you to operate with multiple devices without having to know commands in some cases. So those are tools that are, you can kind of think of those as config management, but they don't come with all the bells and whistles of tools like Ansible and everything. Sometimes those can be really handy, and sometimes those are the right tools for the job as well. Personally, the reason I bring that up is I put off those tools for years longer than I should have, because I found Ansible and it's the coolest thing ever. I don't need it. Python, whatever, I don't need it. And then I realized that I did need it. And I went back, kind of went backwards and learned it, and I realized that those tools have a place as well, especially when Ansible doesn't fit the bill. So it's worth knowing those more core tools that don't come with all the training rules.
Yeah, I would say sort of two different things. One, someone had to talk about time series database and new ways of storing and graphing data. I think that's often overlooked. And if you're not looking at those things, you really should be looking at those things. The second is, I would say, someone asked me earlier, like, what other skills beyond Python coding should they be learning? And I would add two things to that. One, understand something like Flask for building REST APIs, and two, talking to a database in some way. If you want to get beyond just basic scripting, figure out how to write a REST API and figure out how to interface with the database, because pretty much any tool you want to build is going to need at least those two components.
Yeah, and I chime in a little bit too. I know CI/CD was already mentioned, but like just testability is incredibly important. So start to get yourself more up to speed on how do you test things like PyTest, linting, things that help you get the answer of is this right, and that you can run in a repeated way, and that you can get this validation from, is your code doing what it's supposed to do? And then doing that practice in a rigorous manner is very important.
Thank you. So there's been a lot of talk about Yang. So what's the real opinion here on usage and adoption using Yang in some sort of capacity? I see a lot of laughing already.
I don't know, I'm on the fence. I don't want to say I'm a skeptic, but Yang is one of those things I can feel like the specter of S&P, when I think of Yang. And I mean, I get it, I can read it, but I think it's kind of hard. I feel like it's like almost like C code, but not really. Anyway, I find it difficult. I find it unwieldy. I know what it does, and I respect how it does, and I know that we need something. In terms of adoption, at least on the Cisco front, I don't see a ton of adoption, personally. I don't know, maybe Hank, you've seen more, but in terms of Yang adoption, I haven't seen it take off the way I've seen SSH-based shell stuff take off. Now, granted, there's a reason for that, just based on API support and old platforms, but I don't know, I'm on the fence with Yang. I don't know, I really don't know.
Yeah, so, I think the data modeling is important, and I think Yang is the best thing we have right now. I still find it exceptionally difficult and challenging to use, and I think this is probably sort of a combination of the tooling and the models. So I think in the long run it's really important. This is the best we have, so I think we need to try to keep moving forward with it and moving forward with like better tools. And I know like the network to code people have released the Yangify, and David Russo is helping them with that. And I know they have this Rosetta project, so I'm really interested in checking those set of things out. But I do think the process needs to get easier, both with the tooling and with the models, because when I've last experimented with it, I sort of felt in trying to work through some of it, it's just like, okay, I'm not doing this. This is just way too hard. I need something simpler than this, and it was just sort of unworkable when I was last trying it.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. It's about the maturity of the models and the maturity of the tool set. The models that are out there, OpenConfig models, IETF models, they're very hit or miss. Many of them don't compile. Well, not many of them, some of them don't compile, some of the important ones. And then it's a matter of the maturity of the tool set that's out there. It just makes it very hard to make use of it in any meaningful way in a production system.
So just to get a little technical, Yang is just being a data modeling language. I think is great. It's kind of what Kirk was saying. It's feature complete. Kind of really does scheme enforcement very well. I think that's awesome. NetConf and RESTConf kind of come on and actually be transport layer. I think that's what a lot of people kind of tend to think of what's, when they talk about Yanks, well, does iOS or XR or GenOS support OpenConfig or whatever, or their vendor specific models? If the vendors do aggregate on an OpenConfig, I think and see it like that'd be amazing. In between, as Kirk said, we're trying to do some things for Yangifier that are coming out. Hopefully that covers that. And I think the one thing in this process is that we really have understood how hard the usability of the OpenConfig models are, or the IETF models are, for anyone getting into it. It's a hard thing to jump from nothing to this well-nested kind of, even though it has to be. I'll say it's a complex problem and you have to solve it complexly, right? So you simply cannot do it any other way. If you want to be vendor control support, 85, 90% of the features, this is what it's going to be. But in the in-between, I believe there's going to be you can have a Yang model for your implementation that's much simpler if you kind of do the same thing. So you could look at something like, maybe looks more like a Napalm Getters or something like Nick showed with his YAML file, something simplistic like that, using Yang to enforce it that is feature complete for your environment. And I think that there's something there. It's not necessarily, maybe there's a translation from that simplified model to a full open config model so that you can kind of separate that. If we go back to before, where there's the network engineer who doesn't want to go, list dictionary list, go all the way down, and the developer who doesn't mind that as much. Maybe there's something there, just having that translation there, having standards on the outside, and having usability a bit better as well.
I wanted to add a little bit of a technical piece to that, because I think there's a great promise there. And so the promise I see in Yang is that today I go in Python, I query my source of truth database, I get the attributes that I need to populate some part of the config. And then I have to push that through some Jinja template, right? Which to me is a pretty brittle process of spitting out all the syntax that has to be exactly correct on the other end. And so the promise is that I can take a Yang file that my vendor says this device supports. I can run that through something that spits out Python bindings, Python classes. So when I query my database, I get that back typically in a set of Python classes with attributes. I simply copy those attributes over to another set of Python classes that came from my Yang file. And then I just do a JSON dump out of that class. And I'm guaranteed that whatever comes out is going to be compliant with my routing. So there's no more Jinja templates. There's no more guessing about exact syntax for this version of code. If that Yang model got delivered for me from that router and it says it supports it, I can run it through something like pyang bind. I get my Python bindings, and all I have to do is copy Python attributes from my set of classes from querying my database to another set of classes, and then just do a JSON dump, and it goes into the router. And I think that is a huge promise that is really attractive, but we're just not there yet.
When it works, it works.
If it works, it works.
Yeah, add nice. Add one.
Yeah, so I'd add one thing to that, and this is a bit different point than what Matt was saying there, but I think there's this notion that at some point in the not too distant future, whatever the heck that means, that we're going to have this unified data model, and I am incredibly skeptical of that. I would say I seriously doubt that. In 5 to 10 years, and that's me being kind. So I think can be this view that we're going to have this panacea, and the vendors are going to stop, abandon differentiating the products, and the competitive forces there are just so strong, they're not going to commoditize all their equipment. So, I think this notion that there's going to be, these one Yang models that, that you can just push to a whole set of devices. There'll be subsets of that where that might be possible, but as a broad general solution, I just don't see that happening anytime soon.
We'll stick on the data theme here. So we talked a lot about source of truth. So you talk a little bit about the importance of data and the impact of having a source of truth has on network automation.
All right, I'll start with the basic one, and I got nothing to hide. So I've actually, I've been doing this stuff for a few years now, and I've actually never worked with like a real source of truth. I never worked with Inside, I never worked with Netbox, although I intend to. So don't, so I will say that if you're working on a small project where you're new, or even if it's a large project and you have to keep lots of people employed, like I talked about earlier, use YAML files, use JSON files. It's a terrible long-term answer, but if it's centralized and you have it in version control, it can work as a source of truth. Now, I'm not saying it's the right answer by any means, because there's so much wrong with that, but I would consider it to at least, it's like the minimum viable acceptable solution if you're starting out. So at a minimum, at least get to the point where you have version control structured data that represents the things that are important to you. If you're using static inventory files and something like Ansible, fine. Version control it, keep track of it, make sure it's common everywhere. That's like the minimum starting point. I'll let these guys talk about how to do it like professionally.
I would echo that. Don't wait until you have some magical database up and running and doing stuff. Because what you'll find is that there's not that big of a difference between a YAML file and a database in terms of how you structure the data. Because ultimately, at least if you're dealing with something like an ORM, where you have a Python class that you're just instantiating to a SQL database, the Python class easily converts to a dictionary, just like importing YAML converts to a Python dictionary. The structures are all the same as dictionaries, list of dictionaries, blah, blah, blah. So there's not that much difference. It gets you thinking about how to structure your data, and it's a heck of a lot easier to rebuild a YAML file than it is to rebuild a database. So it's a great start to thinking about your data model. But then go build a database afterwards.
I'll almost say, I think that's kind of the perfect way to get started is via YAML. We say this all the time, and if you never outgrow a problem, then you never outgrow it. And so if your environment is set up as just a ton of campus, and you can kind of do some nice things with interfaces and kind of compress this logic. So it's not like, if you have thousands of lines of YAML as opposed to thousands of lines of configuration, you didn't solve much, and absolutely you need to look through other things. But there's actually a lot of advantages, and we talk about integrating with your CI/CD pipeline as an example. Like, how do you test a change? It's not, so there's a ton of great there. But in general, so if you get past that, great. Like that's a good problem to have. But if you never do it, that's fine. Keep it to that. Most of the people I talk about, I've ever really talked about source of truth, are in this room. So, but it's one thing I'm probably most passionate about is just getting it right and just understanding that it is much harder of a problem than just about anything else. I've noticed or seen getting the data right, getting it modeled correctly for your network is just an intrinsically hard problem, and it's very difficult to actually solve fully. So.
A quick question on that. You've talked several times about having separate sources of truth.
Systems of records, yeah.
Right. And then you talk about aggregating it. So when you do that final aggregation, where does that take place? Is it always real time? And you're not really writing that as something separate because then it wouldn't be sort of truth?
Yeah, it's going to depend. And if you saw Davy in what we showed, they're doing exactly the same thing. So they're getting from Netbox, from some piece of information, and from get other pieces. And I believe they just use a dynamic inventory. And we've started seeing some organizations have like within Ansible, you can have like a cache layer, right? Just depends on per the data type, the answer's going to come to you. If this is, listen, if you have to query Salesforce and to get your billing location codes or something like that, and you can't literally hammer that all the time, it doesn't change that much. So you can just go pull it and cache it, but it's definitely per domain, you're going to figure out the right answer.
Yeah, and this is sort of reiterating what other people said. And this is not to, underplay the importance of source of truth in the longer term, and especially as you get larger and larger as far as your automation. But I definitely do think you do not want to put this artificial obstacle in your way of getting things done. So, I had some build outs I had to do. I had a database that probably had 80% of the info I needed for a certain context. For a while, my process was I had a Python script that dumped it and wrote it out to YAML. I had as part of that script, I would add some additional fields that I needed to it. And then I would copy that to another machine. I would use that YAML as my, as for my Ansible playbooks, and it worked perfectly fine, and it still saved me a lot of time. And across time, I saw myself doing this process of duplicating more and more of my database, and it started to be more of a problem. And it's like, okay, I think that pain point has increased enough where it now makes sense to do dynamic inventory. I don't need to be doing this. I can just be pulling this information. That did mean I had to update some things in my database. Okay, I needed to add some fields that I previously didn't have, and then started migrating on that way. But do not let, your current storage prevent you from doing automation.
I have a question that kind of builds on that. So from an individual network engineer's perspective, as they're going on this journey, how far do they have to go in learning tools and skill sets and all these pieces before they should feel comfortable tackling a project in the real world, like in an actual problem? Not just playing in the lab on the weekend, but how far do you have to go before you're ready to go tackle something?
I'll let Ken answer his standard.
It depends.
Yeah. I would say there's useful things you can do with a very limited tool set. Ansible, YAML, Jinja, playbooks. And there are things you can tackle in the real world with that. Make sure you know what you're doing with that before you put it in production, but I think there are very useful things you can do with very limited tool set.
And this sort of comes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning with choose simple problems and perhaps choose your own problems. Like if you have this workflow that you need to do that is totally benign, operating on it, and you have all the data locally potentially, and it saves you an amount of time. Getting that set of skills might not be too hard of an obstacle for you to overcome. But, choose easy problems, choose problems you're not going to cause significant side effects. Choose stuff that's more isolated to you and not wider, and that'll lower that when you can start doing this.
Yeah, so I'll give a real life example. I started working with Ansible for the first time in, February 2017, so maybe a little over 2 years ago. And it was probably about 2 weeks later, again, once I broke all the rules and deployed stuff without asking, 2 weeks later, as I was kind of prototyping my great idea, the one that crashed and burned, I was able to do just basic ACL management on a Cisco ASA firewall in production after about 2 weeks of working with it. And that was, like he said, the basic Ansible core skills, YAML, Jinja 2 playbooks, with a little bit of Git. Not Git, not like Git remotes, no CI/CD, no push, no fetch, no merge. Just the Git add, the Git commit, the Git checkout, the very core functionality of using Git locally. Just start with one box that Ansible and Git on it, and have it give you access to your network, and see if you can just do some basic collection and and if you're able to do some basic config management. We were able to. We had a very specific problem in this environment where we would have to whitelist IP addresses for a short amount of time and immediately withdraw that later. Very simple infrastructure as code. That's the only feature I supported, and it worked reliably. And that's when I kind of had my own personal aha moment. And I saw the value of it if I can scale this.
And just one thing I'll say is, I'll talk a good game about source of truth or this or that, but customer comes or my own environment, I need to get something done. I'll break every rule of the book to get the job done. I mean, it's just the reality. And so, what skill or how far? It's just however much you need to get that first thing done, that minimum amount done. And if it's the transactional, meaning you're not saving the configuration state, it's just a configuration change that just you lose that information and you presume it's correct because the actual state says it's VLAN 10, then that's fine. Just whatever it is to get the job done.
So hi, I talk with a lot of customers, and I can count on one finger the number of customers who have told me that they spend more than 10% of their time configuring routers and switches. Yet the hello world for network automation seems to be pretty much the same all over the place, which is config management, Ansible, something like that. My question is, do you see the same thing I'm seeing? And if so, should we change the hello world of network automation into what?
I don't know that we changed the hello world, but I'm 100% agreeing to everything you're saying. Fundamentally, you probably say the same thing in our age. Just it needs to be contextually relevant to network engineers. So to me, it resonates well. But in actuality, you know, we talked about this all the time, where going through various customers doing like network motivation assessments, and you talk about the workflows, and their time is not spent configuring. It's not spent configuring. It's everything else. It's the process. It's the workflow. It's everything else. So yes and yes, or no and no. I'm not sure how you actually word it, but it's much more to be gained out of all the other integration points, all of the other approval processes, and all the other items on that workflow. If you could just picture a giant workflow diagram where you can kind of go from one to the other. That last little piece where you have configuration management is, generally speaking, the smallest.
I'll also say that I think, you know, like, you know, for example, you know, some vendors have gotten way ahead on API support. Like Juniper's a good example, 10 years of NetConf, no problem. You know, to some Cisco platforms, it's relatively new and frankly still a dumpster fire. I think what the hello world is and the tooling around it is going to change as kind of the baseline for network engineering changes too. So once we see, again, we talked about Yang adoption earlier, if we kind of fast forward and, you know, Kirk's and my skepticism just melts away and we're completely wrong, and NetConf and Yang and RESTConf and those become well adopted, and the SSH type stuff is on its way out, you know, kind of like the promise of IPv6, you know, same kind of story there. But in either case, I think as the tooling will change, as the times change, I don't know how else to phrase that, but if we start to see more people adopting NetConf from the beginning and junior engineers programming devices that way from the beginning and seeing SSH as a fallback when everything's broken, I think our hello world will be a little bit different. Yes?
So, can I submit to you my answer for this? Because I've spoken to some of you about this. And, you know, I've been in this for a very long time, and I've seen both from the vendor perspective and as well as from an enterprise perspective. And again, from my point of view of reducing friction in the overall experience, the unit of API between departments in an enterprise to me has been an Excel spreadsheet. And in your case, it was like an extreme dumpster fire in every single Microsoft Office product. Most of the time, it's an Excel spreadsheet. So if I were to tell my network engineers who are just getting started, learn how to extract and transform data out of an Excel spreadsheet. Like, you're going to get it from, you know, department A wants, you know, some piece of information from you, even if you're not touching the network. It's, to me, that's almost the hello world that is just getting started. I mean, what would you think of that?
I think that's fair. I mean, if you took the data and made Jinja, you know, and fed it through Jinja and got a config out of it, that's what you're talking about, right?
Well, I mean, that's a very tactical example of what network engineers do today. Somebody said, well, how much programming do you need to know? Well, as much programming as you need to know that use an Excel spreadsheet to template build your config, because a lot of people have done it. So my point is, you can use the data in Excel spreadsheet to do anything, whether it's I'm going to generate a config, or I need to provide all the IP addresses to the server team, you know, because they want a spreadsheet of that. You know, it's just processing data. It's extracting and transforming and changing data. It's an easy, non-volatile programming example that I think translates to something everybody has to deal with without touching the network. Right? Maybe it's not an example of network automation,
right,
but it's a function of in the job of what I do with my network.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, you know, that's the hard part is, you know, it's almost like, you know, to Matt's point, it's almost like hello world is like 4 or 5 steps in, you know, because to get to our kind of definition of hello world, you need skills in 3 or 4 things at that point, right? So yours, I think, could be the very first step. You know, it's a much more conservative and attainable goal, I think, for many, because, you know, the Ansible, the Jinja, the YAML, the Git, even those basic skills, it's a multi-week and maybe a multi-month effort for some. And in your case, it's, you know, I mean, of course, if we do the Stack Overflow thing, it's 5 minutes, but if we actually want to understand it, it's a day or 2. But that's still, yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, so I mean, back on Matt's broader question, I mean, I definitely think we, you know, and I like the framework that Matt, you know, that you provided earlier today, just with, you know, I definitely think there's different categories of things. Certain tools are inherently more config-oriented. So like if you're talking Ansible, that's going to be its primary function. You're going to sort of be primarily probably config-oriented. Other tools are much more, they can be in the validation space, they can be in config, they can be in, you know, getting in, you know, visibility in some way or monitoring tools. So there definitely is going to be this like, okay, what tool are we talking about? What does it potentially do well? What does it not potentially do well? I think from a teaching perspective, there's also issues related to motivation. Like I definitely know if I started out early and just saying, oh, we're going to interface to Excel, I'd probably lose a third of my students right there because they want, and this is a different question than like, what can they use a lot versus like, what do they think is cool and interesting? And you sometimes have to balance those factors, which is important because like, when you're going through a long haul of learning a new skill, you have to be motivated across time to do this. So there can be factors like that you need to figure out as well.
Got another question for you. What are some common pain points that individuals or organizations run into when they're trying to do automation?
I'll say the one, and some of you have seen this before, is that trying to do infrastructure as code through just a shell-based, SSH, it's generally hard. We have some helper tools, things like, Napalm can do a merge config and add, Ansible has some capacity to do that as well. There's a higher config. There's a couple other kind of supplementary tools that make it easier. But in general, what you'll notice a lot is that trying to idempotently remove config can be a challenge. Has anyone ever run into that before? Adding config is easy. Removing it is generally harder. And I worked with Ken, last year, and he gave me some ideas about some set theory stuff, and that actually works really well. But it's kind of onerous to configure and manage. And there are, again, higher config is a library. Napalm can do some of it. But one thing I noticed is that things like RESTconf and NetConf, you have your yang model, and if it's not in there, you can do a replace operation, and then here you go. Now everything's fixed, and you get kind of the benefit of all those no commands automatically. And that's a pain point I saw very early, is that even though SSH is easy to get started, you find yourself struggling to remove configuration without, I'll call it relatively complex integrations with other equipment like higher config or custom set theory logic that I've executed many times.
I would steer away from the technical part. I think the challenge is, the big pain point is how to get started. You can send a lot of people to Python and Ansible training, but if they can't figure out the insertion point on where to get started, they're sitting there playing with playbooks on their personal laptop or whatever, and never getting traction in moving forward. And you need someone with some vision that can find those insertion points and gradually build support for that over time. Whether that's putting together a proof of concept and getting something interesting enough that management's willing to hire some people or pull some people off of other projects to work on it, or something you have to figure out that insertion point and get started. I think that's often a challenge.
Yeah, in the same vein, but almost maybe even before, is I think you have a presumption that they will send you to Python training and Ansible training. I think most people are kind of, the way we work, we kind of end up with, one technical person who's had some success in their automation, they would bring us in, and I'll talk to them what their goals are for the year, and they're often way too high for their skill set of their team, so their expectations are way set. And as we spoke about before, their fellow network engineers are asked to do this in 10%, 20%, which is essentially somewhere between 0 and 5% time in all actuality, and it's just. It's a layer 8 political type problem I see most more than the biggest thing to worry about.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this a little bit earlier, but I mean, one common pattern that I see individuals do is just try to tackle too hard of a problem up front. So, I definitely have had several people come to me and say like, oh, I want to, config this firewall that has 10,000 lines, of ACLs on it. It's just like you try to the first hurdle you're trying to jump over is enormous, and you're not going to be successful at it. So, try to get a problem that you can handle and deal with your current skill set.
We got a question, go ahead.
We can discuss something a bit different. So, for those of you who've been in this field for a while, I think, a couple of questions. I'm guessing the need for network automation is not new. So, if that's true, then do you think something has fundamentally changed that the community can succeed now when they did not, let's say, 5, 7, or 8 years ago?
So I'll date myself. I graduated from college in 1996. I went to work for a service provider. The backbone of that service provider, if I wanted to make a config change on that, I went to a database. I updated the database and waited for the config build, test, and push to run that night. This config automation thing we're trying to get to was built and running in 1996. So clearly the need hasn't gone away. What I see, and I'm doing this since then, what I see now though is the tool set that you can leverage, even compared to when I started a company in the space 6 years ago, there's so much more to build on. When I started building something in 2001, you had to build so much code from scratch because there was so little to start with. And so I think what's different now is that there is so much open source out there, so many libraries, so many tools, so many frameworks that you can take off the shelf, that your starting point is light years ahead of where it was in 20 years ago.
The barrier for entry has been reduced drastically.
Yeah, to echo that, I always say, 10, 15 years ago, when we started with this, it was, the only thing you had was CPAN. You go down from CPAN modules in Perl, and there's some various message boards, like some PHP bulletin board, whatever, out there. And if you compare that to what's out there on Git now, it's just night and day. And when you understand not dealing with low level drivers, like you have someone nice enough to publish an Amico out there, it's game changing. And you literally within, and even the build process of getting stuff. I mean, I was talking to someone about the pain points of building stuff in Perl, and it wasn't virtual environments, it wasn't containers, it wasn't all this tooling, this process that just fundamentally has changed it so much.
Yeah, I definitely also think it's fundamentally changed, and I think there's similar things to what these other individuals have stated, and I think there's also just been this awareness of seeing what people in the server world can do, seeing sort of this second generation of tools rise up, with Puppet and Chef, and then later with Ansible and Salt. And seeing, while its original idea was probably misguided, seeing this interest with SDN, and just getting this big wave in automation, and then all these tools and vendors and, being able to leverage these things and virtual devices, that I think this is, a much bigger scope. And I played around with Perl scripts as well in the late 90s, and was doing things, but this is a much broader and, much more fundamental network automation attempt than I think, came before, which was, much more like a drip from a faucet.
So would it be fair to say that a lot of you think that we now reached the tipping point? Because the tool improvement has been gradual. It's not something that was not like a stepping in. So now the question is like, have we reached a tipping point where, things will just, or if not, then what's next?
I mean, I think the tipping point is come and gone. Like, I think we're past the tipping point, personally.
I'll just say I bet my career on that, so.
I think your comment about server automation is a good point. It's like, well, we did it over there. Why aren't we doing it over here? And I think that's part of the driver. That's forcing the tipping point. As I think Jeremy and I had a discussion earlier. The problem with that is that you go, oh, well, I was able to automate my servers, so it's the same thing to automate a network. And automating a distributed system is much more complicated than automating individual endpoints in terms of servers. And I think there's a mistake there. I think that's the driver, but I think the mistake is saying, well, if we did it over there, it's just as easy to do it with network as it was with servers. And my opinion is it's fundamentally, harder, quite a bit harder to do. And if you make that mistake that, oh yeah, it took us 18 months to automate all our servers, so we should take 18 months and we'll automate 100% of our network, you're not going to reach that goal.
Yeah, a question. I'm from the Netherlands, and what we see in company I work for, the people we hire from colleges and universities are much more skilled in programming than people in 30s, 40s, and 50s. So we see that the skill gap we see now with engineering is slowly declining, and that we in 10 years have a situation where we need to learn software better on network work. but if you look at balance networking versus software skills, it's now like 80-20 or something. You see that tipping up?
I'm not sure if that, I can't really give a good, calculation on where that tipping point would be, or if it will come. But what I will say this is, it's still fundamentally two careers, and it kind of goes to the point of, saying about realistic expectations within enterprises. It is a good point to remember. To learn both of these, it took many of us engineers, 5-10 years to really kind of master craft. It takes many people 5-10 years to master another. And we're expecting people to do both and keep competency in both. So it is relatively a hard problem. And this is why, like I said, go back to what I said before, I think there'll be this spectrum of people. I don't not directly answer the question. Yes, I do see some people come out of schools, but I also think we're hiring different. We weren't looking at computer science majors before. We weren't looking for them, even if we did, we were teaching networking. We weren't asking them to talk about CI/CD pipelines or anything. So it's just fundamentally we were asking different questions.
So regarding education, I actually spent 14 years at a university, and I had a research lab and had lots of students in a summer internship program. I think what I see is a huge gap there is that what the CS programs are teaching in terms of networking is nothing like what is real practical networking. And the CS programs see practical networking classes as being tech school still. And there's a room for overlap there. And actually in my past life, I built a summer internship program focused exactly on filling that gap. But I see a big gap there where you still see people coming out of telecom programs that know networking and know CS, and people coming out of CS that don't really understand practical networking, and there's a huge gap to be filled.
I do think across time, and I think we're already seeing this, there's going to be sort of a new generation of people that when you sort of try to understand what career they are, they're basically a combination of both. And I think that, is an ongoing trend. I think that's happening in the server world. I think that's, going to increase happening in the networking world. I think this will imply that some skills, this does not mean you do not, have fundamental networking skills, but I do think some skills are going to have to get dropped to the side, and you sort of have to decide on your preferences and your requirements. And I think we'd already seen this in the networking world. Like, when I was sort of getting started in networking, you could really grasp the whole field. And across time, like, well, I can't grasp all the voice. I can't grasp all, it's just like it became too much in networking, and you're going to see that as programming becomes more important, there's going to have to be some dropping because there's only so much, individuals can learn.
You only need to have to manage this personal experience. I went back for my master's and I finally understood exactly what you're talking about, which is when I went through his classes about telecommunications, there was nothing at all about networking or that there whatsoever. So it finally makes sense to me when kids are coming out of college with no knowledge whatsoever of networking.
John.
Yeah, so you talked a lot about starting with programming, and we can all agree that Ansel is a wonderful tool to get started, in part because it can take you a long way down your journey. So for those people that maybe are already on that journey, kind of a two-part question. One, do you think there is an end to Ansible? And two, if there is, what are some common signs to look for that might be approaching that end?
Just one point of clarification, is there any in terms of their viability or in terms of your like?
So end to usefulness of Ansible.
Within one individual organization. Yeah, I think there's going to be no tool that's going to really be better than what a skilled developer can build for themselves. Fundamentally, anything that you do is going to have to, in order to be customized for your business, to be optimized for your business, absolutely. Any tool, true friend tool.
I would sort of answer this in a more general way that I think when you find yourself working on a problem and you feel like you're constantly banging your head against the wall to use the tool, that you should step back and say, like, am I using the wrong tool? Like at one point I tried to build a NetFlow collector out of Perl, and it was just pain and suffering. And my takeaway from that was, this was just not the right tool for the problem I was trying to solve. And I think that would be the indicators that if you're just having to do insanely complex operations that, only 7 people in the world can understand, and it takes you, 12 hours to do something that should take 7 minutes, these should be indicators that, do I have the wrong tool for what I'm currently trying to do in this situation?
Yeah, and then, specifically, to take that same logic, to give an Ansible example, for those who have worked with Ansible, you might have said to yourself, I got these 12 lines in a playbook that would have taken me 1 or 2 lines of Python. Has anyone ever felt that way working with Ansible? Yeah. It's just the reality sometimes. And, if you have a whole lot of Ansible and you find yourself doing that 2 or 3 times in a big project, then Ansible is probably the right tool. If you find yourself doing it in every other task and you're just cursing yourself, and then you find yourself having to write custom modules and custom filters every 5 minutes, you end up in a situation where you ask the question, is Ansible really the right tool for this job? And I find myself in that boat a lot.
If I may just comment here, I found that discussion today with that, should Python or should Ansible? And personally, I'm not here to defend Ansible. It has good and bad there. I mean, Ansible is built on Python, and it's super extensible. So, it should not be an error that if it doesn't make sense to write the logic in YAML and the code in your DSL, write a notebook, that's what those tools are great. And maybe Ansible is not a good one, but then you use SaltStack and write your own ingredients or we should not oppose it. That's just many people today opposing them, and I just don't get it. I think we're really sending the wrong message because, yes, maybe you should not write those 15 tasks and just write a single module on your own that will take you 2 lines and done.
At that point, haven't you moved to Python?
Yes, but again, still, I have 2 lines of Python and a single module, and I still get all the benefit of the framework.
But what you're writing in is Python. I think that's the idea. When your Ansible starts to get too complicated, there comes a point where it's like, move the Python for a bit, and maybe the way it's consumed is even simpler.
Yeah, I think not the way I understood the discussion was should I start everything from scratch in Python, or should I do everything in Ansible, not writing a single line of code? I think this approach, because all the great tools out there are extensible, should be extended, and they will all have their
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think
we're saying the same
I think everyone's saying the same.
I think where Hank's going with that is once you start to use Python, we're not saying that it's bad. We're not saying that because you used Python, you need to ditch Ansible and start over. But at that point, we acknowledge that you've introduced another tool. It's not bad or good, it's just the reality. So now I have Ansible with a whole lot of Python at the same time. So the indication is I collapsed my 15 YAML lines into a simple Python module, and that's great, and you should do that.
I would agree that you became a more advanced Ansible users or a more advanced Stackstorm user. Ansible is built in Python, and it's based on its nature to be extensible and have built-in modules and You're not switching to the world. You're just becoming an advert.
No, I understand. I guess it's just, again, kind of taxonomy differences. Does extending Python with custom modules and custom filters, constantly, does that constitute using another tool? Maybe, maybe not. But I think, to John's question was, if you can't do it natively in Ansible, you can always kind of escalation of force. Move into more generic, more powerful things like Python that give you the flexibility. But to answer his question, when do you know that you're using the wrong tool? Like Kirk said, it's too hard, it's complicated, no one can understand it, collapse it, use Python. So that was a good decision of using the right tool for the right job within the context of the Ansible framework. So I think we're all saying the same thing here.
Yeah, just to add on to that, Damien. So, I think part of that is a little bit how to do with how Ansible is frequently framed. That, it's frequently framed as there's no coding involved. So, I think this is sort of I think that's totally the logical choice for what you should do frequently. If you're running into bigger pain points with Ansible, your first thought should really realistically be, can I break out into Python to do a custom filter, a custom module, and simplify your problem. I would sort of say, as you evolve and go a certain point in time, and sort of Nick was alluding to this, is if you're constantly doing that, then I think you could still circle back on the same point of is this the optimum tool if I'm constantly going outside of that to, develop there?
I'm personally against tool dashing in general. I just think that it doesn't help the
We have one question here.
sorry, just an additional data point. One thing that I constantly ran into when I was starting with this is I was, in my mind, I was framing the problem in a way that Ansible just isn't meant to do. Right? So you have the declarative syntax, and I was trying to make it do things that it wasn't meant to do. Right? And the problem wasn't something that could be solved with Ansible. I was just trying to do it in a way that really wasn't appropriate. So sometimes you just, like you said, take some steps back and reassess it. Don't worry about it.
I just have one last question. We're running a little bit over here. So who's the network automator, Air Force or Marines?
I'm gonna look to stretch. I'm gonna look to stretch with you.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of interesting stuff going on with the Marine Corps.
Any more questions out here? I know we're running a little over. I'm sure there's some cocktails everyone's waiting for.
They're gone now. We screwed you. Sorry.
Ken said he's buying, so we're good. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.